The midterm budget today will outline plans for South Africa's state-owned enterprises as they grapple with cash flow problems, governance issues and debt. The Department of Public Enterprises is going ahead with unbundling Eskom, while SAA is looking for funding to implement its business rescue plan. Arms manufacturer, meanwhile, Denel, also seeking a 4.5 billion rand bailout. So what can we expect from the budget as far as SOEs are concerned? To unpack the story for us, we're joined now by Ronny Mkhwanazi. He is a corporate and trade lawyer at Mkhwanazi Incorporate. Ronny, good morning. Thanks very much for your time this morning. I mean, it is a long list. It's a long wish list as it pertains to SOEs. I mean, SOEs in the minds of South Africans really just a dark hole for our taxpayer funds to go down into. What do we know about how much the finance minister can do in terms of the wish list that SOEs have?
Okay, good morning and thank you for having me. I think your introduction was spot on. There's a long list of challenges that SOEs have, and the minister is really in a tight corner. But I think it's important also to, tell the viewers, just to give them a brief background of what SOE is about and how they operate. So, for example, the IMF recently did a study, a review basically of SOEs amidst COVID-19 to get a sense of, whether they're effective or not in the bigger scheme of things. And what has been established was that SOEs currently account for about $46 trillion of GDP, that is, globally. And that makes it about 50% of, global GDP. They have become very sophisticated, major corporations around the world. And the reason we have SOEs is because the state uses these institutions to accelerate socio-economic development in countries. But where we are, unfortunately, in the South African environment, SOEs, I think firstly there's been a misunderstanding of what their roles are. There's also a proliferation of SOEs. Some institutions that are considered as SOEs, which have boards of companies and so forth, should not be SOEs and should not be having these boards. And I will give examples as we go on and so forth. But currently in South Africa, there's a very, negative perception, especially because of all the bailouts that the SOEs go to beg from Treasury from time to time. But in the main, SOEs are very important for governments around the world and can really be used as an effective tool for economic transformation, but also for provision of services where private sector necessarily doesn't want to put up the money up front to do it. So it's a very important institution for governments around the world. And the minister today basically has a task set before him. There's major corporations like your SAAs, which are really battling. Eskom is one of the examples you gave earlier on today. So outside of the financial issues that affect SOEs, I think that is just one of the problems we have. And I think as we go on in the interview, we'll cover on some of them.
Yeah. In fact, let's zoom in on SAA now. It's probably got one of the worst reputations of SOEs in South Africa, what they meant to do versus what SAA has been through over a decade now. They've been clear in terms of the business rescue plan that more funding is needed to keep a different version of the airline afloat. So Treasury has committed to getting that funding. The big question is, where will the money come from?
Yes, and of course it's an important question, and I think the short answer to that is the fact that we will have to borrow the money from somewhere for us to be able to fund SAA and other institutions, that are affected by these bailouts and so on. But if you look at what happened in SAA, for example, especially say over the past 10 years, the fundamental issue you had at SAA is an issue around leadership. That you found that over the past, 10, 12 years or so, you had boards that were appointed to SAA composed of people who are not from the aviation industry generally, or at least not even the majority of them being from that industry. You had chairpersons of the boards of SAA who were not business people, had no clue how a business should be run and so forth. So I think ultimately that is the biggest issue that, SAA suffered over the past few years, because naturally what happens is that if you bring in people who don't understand the business, and they get, blockages from executives who understand how the business should be run. They eventually start suspending people left, right, and center, as you've seen at Denel, at the Zondo Commission yesterday. that executives were being purged in SOEs, and this is mainly because the people that were brought into these SOEs did not have the interest of those SOEs at heart, but were purely there for their own, amusement. And I think that's one of the issues amongst many other issues that our South African SOEs review need to consider. How do we appoint board members? It doesn't make sense to me, for example, to have a board in an industry as technical and as complex as aviation and not even have, a board member who understands actually how the industry works. And I think those are some of the gaps that will have to be closed as we move forward.
Yeah, really appalling that those gaps even exist to begin with, Ronny. But let's talk about Eskom now. All institutions, from ratings agencies to our own Reserve Bank, have put the blame pretty squarely on the shoulders of Eskom when it comes to how our economy is doing and our lack of ability to attract foreign investment as well. So when we talk about what Eskom needs to do now to get its house in order, to get power supply running smoothly, to get us a reliable power supply so we can, among other things, attract that foreign investment. So what does Eskom now need to do?
Look, I think that the importance of any organization starts, with the leadership that you put there. I think Eskom, like many other SOEs, has been, a victim of this leadership problem that we've referred to. You would have people on the board of Eskom. And by the way, I'm not saying that only people from the industry should be there, but you should have a mix, and at least majority of the people you have in that board should at least be from the industry and have some what we call skin in the game, so to speak. So I think leadership goes hand in hand with stability of the organization, which is very critical if the organization has to achieve its objectives. And of course, with that then comes the skills that are required in the organization to make sure that you're able to move the organization forward. And there's no doubt that Eskom did at some point have all the skills that we're talking about. But if you're looking at where Eskom is now, the issue that Eskom has is actually bringing Medupi and all the other power stations that have been, constructed over the past few years online. I think that's where the problem is. And if you go back historically to see what happened, it was an issue once again of poor planning, poor resource allocation, poor procurement practices, which ended up with, Eskom spending, hundreds of billions on a system that eventually, when it was supposed to start working, failed and didn't work. And they then had to have more, international engineers to come in to transfer our decisions. So I think basically that's where we are. But I'm happy that, from a leadership point of view, Eskom seems to have stabilized itself. It's still a long journey to go. But the important thing for Eskom to do is to make sure that those power stations that have been developed need to get online so that we may, and also, of course, to open up the market. I'm very happy to hear, over the past few weeks that there's been more talk around renewables, opening up the renewable space so that we can alleviate, some pressure of the national grid and so on. And I think that's a step in the right direction. We did it exceptionally well in the beginning of the 2000s, and somewhere along the line, we lost direction and started seeing this, alternative energy as a curse rather than a blessing to us. And I think with all this combination of factors, we will eventually get to a point where we have a stable Eskom, stable leadership, and of course a stable grid. And ultimately, I think that's what we're aiming for.
Ronny, let's stay on the topic of SOEs now and move on to the Land Bank, another SOE that has been deemed crucial for our economy. Back in June, the finance minister gave the Land Bank 3 billion rand. They've now asked for this medium-term budget policy statement to get another 10 billion rand effectively. I mean, how do we judge whether these funds are being used effectively? What kinds of decisions on the part of the Land Bank will the minister be looking at as he weighs up this request for 10 billion rand this time round?
Look, one of the challenges that the IMF, review referred to was the fact that there isn't proper, monitoring and oversight of these institutions, mainly because the state doesn't have, or most states don't have the capacity to provide that oversight. And secondly, because once we are in that situation where you can't provide oversight, you then have a lot of hidden debt that eventually crops up in these SOEs. And as a shareholder, with being the state, you're then shocked when they come to you with a bow saying, please bail us out. But the reality is that insofar as South Africa is concerned, The challenge is whether the challenge is at Eskom, SAA, or DENEL is fundamentally the same issue. It's an issue about, firstly, understanding what an SOE is and to review those SOEs to see what value they actually bring to society, which is something we don't do. We never actually sit back and review and say, okay, we have an Eskom that is in this situation. Is Eskom adding value to our country, our society, and the economy at large? Yes or no? If yes, what needs to, or how can we, enforce that or amplify it? If no, how then do we do it? Take, for example, in Germany. Germany has a biannual review of all its state-owned enterprises and so forth. So the minister basically will be looking at, and this is the other problem, if you are a business and you know that if you fail, you can run to Big Daddy to get a bailout, chances of you making it are really very slim. And I think that is where the issue is, performance management of these institutions. Like typically where a minister gives a bailout, he would look at the importance of that, organization in our society. The Land Bank had the same issues I referred to earlier on around leadership, where you take a board and you put on people who are not farmers or who don't have an agriculture background. It makes it very difficult for them, to operate and understand the environment in terms of when you give loans, how that should work, how it should be recruited, and so forth. So I think the minister will bail out the Land Bank as is already undertaken. But this won't solve the problem. The problem is we need to go back to the drawing board and decide which SOEs are working and which ones are not working, and to reconfigure them, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Ronny, thank you so much for giving us some incredible insight there into why this is so important, particularly as it pertains to the country's state-owned entities. Ronny Mkhwanazi is a corporate and trade lawyer, at Mkhwanazi Incorporated. And of course, that is as we build up to the medium-term budget policy statement that takes place at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Of course, you can catch it live right here on Channel 405.